Welcome to the latest episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. This is episode 230. What are net carbs and do they actually matter? Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real World Nutrition. I'm Shelly Rael and I am continuing part of this mini series I'm doing on carbohydrates here on the podcast. Now, I have mentioned this before. I did a much longer series about carbohydrates on my blog back in January 2026. That I'm not covering every single thing on the podcast, but just want to let you know that you can go reference that. I have links in the show notes to the blog series or the ones related to this. So just get that out of the way here. So in some previous episodes here, so in episode 228, talked about what are carbohydrates and their roles in the body and how they're often misunderstood. And then in last week's episode, 229 was Fiber 101. So I'm going to do a little bit of a review about fiber today, but that goes into a deeper dive into the different types of fiber and what it does in the body. So as I said in today's title, we're talking about a term that shows up a lot in diet culture, in popular diet culture. Now, if you've not heard this before, you might just not have noticed it because it's been around for a while. And even when I first heard it, I wasn't sure what was going on. So this is the net carbs. So this is mostly from the low carbohydrate or the ketogenic spaces where people are talking about this lower carb or net carbs, I should say. And this is where the term most likely shows up. But it also, of course, it's always on social media, but it is also found on food packaging or in conversations about blood sugar and weight management. So today I want to talk about what exactly are net carbs? And more importantly, does it really matter? Do net carbs matter? So again, let's start with the basics. Quick overview here. Carbohydrates are one of the three macronutrients along with protein and fat. So in episode 227, I covered the 6 classes of nutrients, essential nutrients. So again, 3 macros, protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And then carbohydrates are made up of 3 main components, or there's 3 types of carbohydrates. That's starch, sugar, and fiber. And then again, I've previously said this in earlier episodes. Starch and sugar are digested into glucose. And then glucose enters the bloodstream where it's used for energy or it's stored for later use. So blood glucose, blood sugar, I use those terms interchangeably. Glucose is a type of sugar. And then fiber, also a carbohydrate, but it behaves differently because we as humans cannot fully digest fiber. And some fibers pass through the GI or the digestive tract mostly intact, while some others are fermented by gut bacteria and helps produce short-chain fatty acids that help with gut health. So this overview here is necessary for making that distinction here between digestible carbohydrates and the non-digestible carbohydrates. And that's how this net carb concept comes from. So net carbs are generally defined as the carbohydrates in a food that are believed to impact blood sugar. So the most common formula looks like this. You look at the nutrition facts panel, you look at the total carbohydrate grams, so total carbohydrate grams, and then you subtract fiber grams, and that equals net carbs. Now, I just want to say that's the most common formula. There's variations that also subtract sugar, alcohols, or certain types of added fibers. And here's the thing, on paper, it looks very simple. A food contains 20 grams of total carbohydrates and 8 grams of fiber. So some might say that's 12 grams of net carbs. And that's the reason here is that fiber doesn't raise blood glucose the same way that starch and sugar do. So we don't count the fiber, or that's what the concept is. And it sounds pretty straightforward. But here's the catch here. Net carbs are not a formally recognized nutrition concept. They don't appear in the dietary guidelines for Americans. They're not defined in standard nutrition textbooks. They're not part of professional dietetics training as a standalone metric. And this doesn't mean that this concept of net carbs is completely meaningless, but it means it wasn't developed through the same scientific framework as total carbohydrate, fiber, or added sugars. So where did this net carbs term come from, or this net carbs concept come from? Well, the concept gained traction in the resurgence of low carbohydrate diets in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And some of you may not be old enough to know that's a resurgence because Dr. Atkins, who was one of the original-ish low carbohydrate proponents, had his first version of it in the 1970s. So mentioning him, because the Atkins style approaches, the Atkins style diet was very, very popular in the late 90s and early 2000s. And since then, there's been different forms of it with different names. But here's the big picture. These diets have strict limits on total carbohydrate intake. So then the net carb calculation allowed individuals to subtract fiber and sometimes sugar alcohols from total carbohydrate counts, making certain foods appear more compatible with low carb diets. So in reality, let's just say what it is. It functioned as a workaround. So it allowed someone to eat a product that technically contained carbohydrates while still staying within that self-imposed limits, because once they did all their net carb math, however it was done, the total carbs seemed, or I shouldn't say total carbs, the net carbs came out a lot lower, so they were, quote, allowed to have those foods. And then here's the thing. Food manufacturers recognized the market opportunity pretty quickly. Food manufacturers are on top of trends so quickly, they throw stuff on the front of the package as soon as it becomes trendy. So what started happening is products were labeled as low net carb or net carb friendly, and that began appearing across grocery stores. But here's the important point here. Net carbs are not defined or regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. Now, that may not be a big thing, but what makes this important is that different companies may calculate them differently. So some will subtract all fiber, some will subtract only certain types of fiber, some subtract sugar alcohols entirely, others partially, and there's no standard definition. There's been times where I'm looking at a nutrition facts label and I'm doing all kinds of math trying to figure out how they come up with their total calories because it's not adding up. And it's because of these various ways of calculating net carbs. Now, whether it's entirely legal, there is regulations around these nutrition facts panels. It's hard to say, but I've done all kinds of different math, mostly so you don't have to, but it's a lot of just very interesting math. Now, why does this matter? Well, in nutrition science, we focus on nutrients with their defined physiological roles and measurable effects. So what this means is carbohydrate, fiber, and added sugars fall into the category of what we understand their physiological roles, and we can measure those effects. But net carbs aren't part of that. So why? Well, first, not all fibers behave the same way in the body. As I said in last week's episode on Fiber 101, there's the soluble fibers, there's the insoluble fibers, there's the resistant starches, there's functional fibers that are added during processing. And each of these differ in how they affect digestion, satiety, fermentation in the gut, and blood glucose response. And this assumption that all fiber has zero impact on blood sugar isn't accurate. Second, sugar alcohols can vary widely in their metabolic effects, so what it will do within the body. Some will have minimal impact on blood glucose. Others can raise blood sugar to a certain degree, and many can cause gastrointestinal symptoms when they're consumed in larger amounts. And when I say larger amounts, that's highly individual. But let's just say the warning label on things with sugar alcohols says it may have a laxative-like effect. and it can be pretty profound. And then the third aspect of this, and this is critical, is blood glucose responses vary between individuals. So 2, 3, 8 people can eat the exact same food and have very different glucose responses. Insulin sensitivity, our gut microbiome composition, our physical activity, sleep, stress, and overall dietary patterns really all influence how the body responds to those foods. And because of this variability, a single net carb number cannot reliably predict what will happen physiologically. So I want to address one of the more common arguments in favor of net carbs, though, and this is blood sugar control. So for individuals living with diabetes or insulin resistance, understanding how foods affect blood glucose is important, and that's not in question. But subtracting fiber from total carbohydrates is not a substitute for blood glucose monitoring, portion awareness, meal timing, or balancing your macronutrient intake, or more balancing your plate. Now, it may seem obvious. Okay, we're obviously not going to just rely on net carbs and ignore blood glucose control and portions, but let me just tell you, I've been around for a long time. People do this. So, to clarify, fiber can slow digestion and blunt or minimize that rise in blood sugar and can reduce the magnitude of a spike. So if we have something without fiber, even if it's natural sugars, we can have a spike in our blood glucose, but fiber can help minimize that, but it doesn't erase the carbohydrate content of a food. So a food with a high total carbohydrate load can still raise blood sugar significantly, even if it contains fiber. So for example, potatoes are a source of starchy food, starchy carbohydrate, or the carbohydrate starch, and it also contains fiber. And most people aren't eating it by themselves, but it's going to have, in a lot of cases, a significant impact on blood sugar if it is eaten by itself. So that fiber isn't going to erase that carbohydrate load. Now, for people managing diabetes, what's important here is consistent carbohydrate intake, appropriate portion sizes, and then the balanced meals that include the protein and healthy fats, which is a much more reliable tool than focusing on net carbs. So here's the thing. Do net carbs ever have any purpose or benefit? Well, in a limited sense, it does serve as a reminder that fiber matters. If someone compares two similar products and notices that one contains more fiber, that may correlate with improved satiety and more gradual glucose responses. And here's an example. There's this brand of tortillas that I like because they're high in fiber and not too high in calories. Not a major thing, but if I have regular white flour tortillas, there's not that much fiber in them, and they're good. But it's going to have a higher starch content, higher total carbohydrate content. But these tortillas that I really like that have 6 grams of fiber in them, great, I'm getting extra fiber here. So I'm not buying them because of the quote net carbs. I'm buying them because I like them, and it helps me get a little bit more fiber in them. In my diet, I should say. So you can look directly at total carbohydrate and fiber on the nutrition label and make an informed decision without subtracting the numbers. So on those tortillas, I don't care about the net carbs. I'm just thrilled that it's got the 6 grams of fiber in it. So one of the biggest practical concerns about net carb counting is how it can influence food choices. Because of this, yes, things that are higher in fiber are great. However, many products that are marketed as low net carb are highly processed foods. And they often rely on added fibers, sometimes sugar alcohols, and refined ingredients engineered to meet a marketing target. So technically, they may fit in or within a net carb limit that somebody may have when they're following a lower carbohydrate diet. But nutritionally, it may not be a high quality food. And at the same time, an excessive focus on net carbs can lead people to restrict fruits, whole grains, and legumes because this is not good. We want those foods. These foods have consistently shown to have positive associations or effects of our long-term health outcomes, and this is a huge body of research. So we don't want to restrict fruits. We don't want to restrict whole grains. We don't want to restrict legumes, beans, that sort of thing. But when people are just focused on numbers, they may start doing that. It always amazes me that people are like, we should not eat fruit. Oh, yes, we do. We do. We do want to eat fruit. We just don't want to have a lot of it. And we want it to have to be part of our overall intake, not just fruit by itself. So I gotta say this. I say this a lot. Nutrition doesn't happen in isolation. So to focus on this one aspect of our food is not appropriate because we look at dietary patterns, not isolated numbers. And I know that's hard for a lot of people to grasp because people are so focused on calories or counting things when it comes to food. But we've got to look at our overall pattern. No one food, no one meal, no one day is what makes or breaks our health. So what does matter more than net carbs? Total carbohydrates that align with individual needs. We want to get adequate fiber from a variety of plant foods. Balanced meals that include protein, both animal and plant foods. Healthy fats, carbohydrates together. So meals are food that include protein, fat, and carbohydrate. And ideally, minimal reliance on ultra-processed products. Sometimes ultra-processed products are fine. That could be plant-based milks because you can't tolerate dairy. Or it could be yogurt because by some definitions, it's a ultra-processed food. So I'm not saying we have to avoid them altogether, but we're really thinking of minimal reliance on those foods that are high in added sugars, high in added fats, high in added sodium, and maybe cut back on those foods that are all net carb all over the place because they may be ultra processed because of all the fiber that needed to be added. And what's more important here? Consistency over time. These are things that these principles of balancing our meals consistently over time. Fiber from plant foods, total carbohydrates that fit, are supported by decades of research and reflected in national and international guidelines. So these are not new concepts. Carbohydrates include, reminder, starch, sugar, and fiber. Fiber matters. It's important for digestive health, satiety, metabolic health, but it does not cancel out the total carbohydrates. It's part of a package. So this is really helping with understanding that distinction is more useful than, like I was saying earlier, chasing a number that was created within a diet culture rather than formal nutrition science. So when you see net carbs on a package, recognize it for what it is. It's a marketing-driven calculation. It's not regulated. So when we use the terms lower fat, reduced sodium, those are regulated terms. Net carbs is not. There's no standardized scientific metric here. For most people, this just adds a layer of complexity without meaningful benefit. I'll just say, it reminds me of the days when people were calculating points. Foods were related to points, and it was related to, I can't even remember what it was. It was related to Weight Watchers, and foods had points. And it did go back. Actually, now that I think about it, it does go back to that because it did calories, fat, and fiber, I think were the three metrics that were used to calculate points, which was a proprietary calculation. So theoretically, nobody knew it. I did have it at one point. Anyway, this just adds complexity without meaningful benefit. Whether we're counting points, counting net carbs, counting whatever it may be, really take a step back and consider, are you working on your blood sugar management? Then focus on consistent intake and portion control, awareness, balanced meals, and individualized guidance. Like I said, blood sugar, these are different responses in different people, even with the same foods. If you're working on Evaluating your food quality. Look at the full picture. Ingredients, fiber content, added sugar, overall pattern. Carbohydrates are not the enemy. They are a macronutrient with important physiological roles. And understanding them is really more powerful than doing some creative equations here to make them justified. And that's what really matters. All right, everyone, that's it for today's episode. I'm going to keep continuing talking about what reality is related to our food and how we apply this in the real world, as real world nutrition does. So I just once again want to thank you for listening. Share this episode with someone who has questions about net carbs or is talking about net carbs or is a devotee of net carbs. I may not change their mind, but it's educational. And if you're following along with the carbohydrate series, I do have links in the show notes for the blog posts and previous episodes for more context. So if you jumped in here without listening to those other two, I encourage you to go back and listen to those as well. All right. And again, that's it for this week's episode. You take care and bye for now.